Action.
So we're coming to you from Los Osos, California, on the Central Coast, and beautiful little village that I've been living in since the beginning of July. And we're here today with Chris Dicus, who's one of our neighbors, and I'm really excited to introduce Chris and his work and what I feel can be possible as a result of this conversation that we're having today. He's a true devotee of the forest world and how the wildfire and all can be tended to in a good way. Professor at Cal Poly. Tell me what's your actual title? And
well, business card says I'm a professor of wildland fire and fuels management.
There we go.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn today about what that means, how the relationship between wildland and where we live, and what particularly struck me that I wanted to bring into the conversation was a conversation with Chris's wife, Melissa, who was saying that, you know, we've accepted the new normal of having fires and villages burning and everything, and we all know at a deep level that something entirely different could get created, and the art of living is all about that, being creative. So welcome and thank you for coming into this conversation straight off of being on the road.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So you're very highly coveted right now, of course, because of the situation with fires so, prevalent in our lives. Let's start out by addressing this notion of how we've adopted this fixed idea of the new normal and what you feel is possible with your expertise.
Well, we've certainly seen, just devastation that's just been unparalleled. Out of the 5 most destructive wildfires in California's history, we've had 4 of those just in the last 18 months. And so everything is kind of pointing, that it's like, oh my gosh, this is the new normal. And, a large part of what's happening is sort of a product of our own making, how we build our communities, where we build them, the way that we manage the land. And this is kind of an issue that's been happening for like over 100 years in the making. And it's almost like the chickens have come home to roost right now. And so, we've been learning. We've learned a lot of things in terms of like wildfire and how we can protect ourselves. But I think at least for the foreseeable future, until we can get a really good handle on this, it is going to seem like, oh, here we go again. It's almost like an annual wildfire tradition, like we broke the latest new record. But again, I contend that this is a human problem, and we're smart enough as a species that if we choose, we make that political will to do it, we can fix this problem. But it's a people problem.
Right. Yeah, which goes to my whole thing with the art of living, which is that the shift that's called for is perceptual. So it's how do we see our relationship with nature, with one another? Do we understand ourselves as creator beings, in which case we can create what we want versus just, manage circumstances. Mm-hmm. So in a best case scenario, I imagine that it's a combination of the people with the structures that are in place from the government and all. And so what light can we shed on that? What can people start out taking steps? What could happen that they could become more participatory?
Well, that's a great thing you talk about being participatory, because it has to be a partnership between all these different sorts of groups. Historically, people, they've dealt with fire. It's like, well, what are you going to do about wildfire? It's like, well, I'm going to call 911, and it's like, but under these massive things, the fire service is so overwhelmed. I mean, if you're expecting a fire truck to show up in your driveway, it's not going to happen. It's just because things are so overwhelmed when these things are happening. They're just massive fires. They're moving so quick. And a lot of times when these these wind-driven fires that are happening, where we're seeing the real destruction, the firefighters aren't even fighting the fire. They're knocking on doors telling people, get out, get out. And so they're trying to take actions the best they can, but they can only do so much. And so it's almost like if you look at fire as a battlefield, and if the warriors are, the soldiers, it's like, well, you don't try to meet the enemy on their terms. And so I think that, if we're able to shape the battlefield, beforehand, to allow these first responders, the firefighters, law enforcement, others to get in there to better make their job, that's what we got to look at. But, shaping the battlefield means a whole lot of things. And as a resident, one thing one could do is be able to modify the things that might burn around the house, where like be landscaping or mulch right next to the house. Just little simple things to the house itself, like putting in around your vents. Every house has got to have vents to allow the breathing that's there. But putting in sort of like a 16th inch mesh screen just to keep embers from coming in and burning the house out. So there's a lot of things that one can do from a residential side. But just them, doing that themselves, we still have to rely on the firefighters. We have to rely on law enforcement. We have to rely on each other when these fires are happening.
So in terms of the preventative measures and the precursors, so it's not just like happening to us in the moment like it wasn't already forecast, tending to our property in the way you're speaking about, becoming more neighborly, becoming more acquainted with our neighbors and all. You and I, when we spoke a little bit before this conversation, we were talking about, no matter how well a particular household might do, if their neighbors aren't tending to their properties, then they're still going to be at risk.
Oh, and I've seen that over and over and over, where it's frustrating. So for an individual, so California has laws on the books that if you live in an area in which CAL FIRE has responsibility for fire, that you're required to create what we refer to as 100 foot of defensible space. And that's not a moonscape. It's you can landscaping. Basically, what you're trying to do is trying to keep flames off the house and also trying to reduce the amount of radiant heat that might be able to ignite it. And so a person will do everything they can to have done everything right, but the law only says going up to your property line. And so if your neighbor doesn't take, the steps, the same steps that you had, that neighbor is putting you at risk. And I've seen that over and over and over, where the person is so frustrated where they've done everything right. It's like, this is perfect, except your neighbor that's 20 foot away, and so that's huge.